The guest for this episode is Vineet Gill. He spoke about his pursuit of literature, the Hindi writer Nirmal Verma, and the state of literary translations in India. A well-known name in Hindi literature, Nirmal Verma is known mainly for his fictional works. Born on April 3, 1929, he obtained an MA in History from Delhi University. He studied Czech at the Oriental Institute in Prague and has been a fellow of the International Institute for Asian Studies. Nirmal Verma is a recipient of India's highest literary award, the Jnanpith, and his short stories Kavve or Pani won the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1985. Vineet Gill is a writer and works as a senior editor at Penguin Random House, India. Earlier, he worked for the Sunday Guardian and the Times of India. His essays, often literary critical and occasionally personal, have appeared in various Indian and international publications. He is an engineer by education. He is the author of Here and Hereafter, Nirmal Verma's Life in Literature, published by Penguin in September 2022. Links are provided in the show notes to buy the book and also to the article by Nirmal Verma on Borges, the great Argentine writer. This article is translated by Vineet Gill.
When did actually Nirmal Verma, the writer, enter into your life? When and how?
I don't have a sort of specific memory. I can't pinpoint the date, and the year. But what I remember is that I can recall a book, a hardcover, second-hand hardcover edition of Verma's book of essays, Shabd or Smriti, Word and Memory, which I chanced upon at a pavement bookstall in Daryaganj, Old Delhi, and this was many years ago. Yeah, I think around 10 years, 10 years ago.
So you were in college at the time, or?
No, I'd finished. I was working as a journalist in Delhi. So I would frequent that market that we used to have in Daryaganj, which is no longer there. It's been shifted to a more sanitized location nearby, but it's lost its vibrancy and charm. That it used to have, and that a lot of people in our city connected with. So one found a lot of wonderful books, rare gems in that market. William Empson's poems, I remember finding there. Strange books, that you wouldn't expect to be lying neglected on a street corner, and books that that still kind of have the potential to change your life. Such books you came across in that market. So one such book for me was Nirmal Verma's Shabd or Smriti, a book of essays, a book of critical and personal essays. A very slim volume, and I looked at it, and I opened the epigraph page towards the beginning, and the epigraph was by, if I'm not mistaken, it was by Walter Benjamin, the German writer, who's also very dear to me, who's been very important to me for many years. And I'd been reading Benjamin in those days very carefully, and so it was a kind of a slight shock, and the kind of a very comforting sense of recognition as well when I saw Benjamin's name on that opening page. And then as I flipped through the pages, there were those other markers of European literature and philosophy that I was familiar with, but it was all in a language that I had developed a complicated relationship with, Hindi. So that book became my entry point into Hindi literature, as such, and into the Hindi literary imagination, and so yeah, it was a kind of a strange merging of the foreign and and the native, as it were, for me, and of a language that is supposed to be my mother tongue, and a culture that I was educating myself in around that time, and that education continues even now. So yeah, so that's when I discovered Nirmal Verma, somebody uh, who wrote in Hindi, but who had a very kind of international, multicultural outlook in his approach to writing, in his approach to literature. So I read that, and through that I went to other books by Verma over time without planning to, unsystematically. And over the years, it all came together, and I thought I had a few things to say about this writer. So that's when the idea for the book occurred to me.
You said this is your entry point into Hindi literature.
This was my kind of entry point into Hindi literature as a serious reader. I had been exposed to it in school. I'd read a few Premchand stories, for instance, and I'd responded well to them. I mean, I can say that now because I still remember bits and pieces of that, of some of those stories, and um, I think it was called Eidgah, if I'm remembering correctly. So I, yeah, I've been exposed to Hindi, but I grew distant from Hindi as I grew older, and um, for a variety of reasons, I think uh, having to do with the kind of society we're in and the kind of childhood I had, I've developed kind of early on in college. I developed aspirations to be a writer, to write, and English seemed like the only language to express yourself in, you know. And yeah, because I believe when I was growing up, Hindi literature had lost its standing in urban Indian culture. The city that I was in, Delhi, it's the people here, the education system, the administrative class here. Everyone set such high store by the English language. It became a kind of a card for you, a kind of a gateway into so many different worlds. It opened up new possibilities if you could master this one language. That's what we were taught when I was growing up, that you could get into the best colleges in the world, you could get the best jobs. It's all your ticket to a better life was the English language. You know, it. So I when I think back uh, towards those days, about those days, I it occurs to me maybe these were the reasons that Hindi never appealed to me as a youngster. You know, so reading Verma and reading others after Verma more carefully, for me became a project of rediscovering Hindi as a literary language. I'd known and understood, and I still I speak Hindi in a very instrumental way, where we have a vocabulary of about 200 words, and we say the same sorts of things to our family members and friends. That kind of Hindi I have. But literary Hindi is very different, just as literary English is very different from the instrumental English that we may speak in offices and other places. So, yeah, Hindi as a literary um, language, I uh, I got to rediscover through Verma. But when I was growing up, there were books. There were books. There was a book market right outside where we lived. We lived in Darya, near Darya. And so one was exposed to this constant presence of the written word. There were books on the shelves. There were a lot of Russian novels in translation. Um, but the I began reading when I went to college. I left India and I went to a country in Eastern Europe called Bulgaria to study engineering. It was, just kind of another strange and random journey that I undertook uh, at a very young age. I think in a pure spirit of discovery and curiosity more than anything else. So um, over there, I became a, a serious reader. I I started reading serious books for the first time, I think, and these were the Russians, mostly, all invariably the Russians. the and I remember sort of being moved intensely by those novels, so much so that they came to completely occupy my imagination, my mind, and I couldn't focus on my studies at all. It was just this the novel that was on my desk, something by Dostoevsky or Turgenev or Chekhov, all the big books without feeling intimidated in the least. I don't know how, because now they have acquired an intimidating aura about them. A book like War and Peace, which was it seemed very accessible to me at that point for some reason. Um, and even the ideas, even the very sort of complex philosophy it advances, that Tolstoy advances, his theory of time, etc. Um, Rather dry and academic stuff. There are stretches in that novel, but yeah, um, because maybe that was because I was not studying English literature. I had no contact with this subject, with English literature as a discipline. So I wasn't aware of the reputations of these writers and these novels, and they didn't come in the way at all of my reading. Yeah. So yeah, I think towards college, I wouldn't say I grew up in the literary environment, but I sort of landed into a literary um, setting, or a setting that was conducive to my literary education.
So Nirmal Verma too, he stayed, I think, a decade or so abroad in Europe. Is that what drew you to Nirmal Verma?
No, it became a kind of it became a point in his biography that resonated with me. Um, the landscape was familiar to me. What he was saying about Prague in the 60s, um, uh, I could recognize that, and I still recognize that when I travel sometimes to Europe, and mm, where I lived in Sofia in the early 2000s, and um, it it had a mix of kind of um, it had a mix of um, the new and the old, the West and the East, the Soviet past, the appendages of that past, as well as the hopes and dreams of of a purely kind of laissez-faire capitalist future that it was looking at, that country, and it failed in very many ways to achieve that. And so we were living through that decade and an interesting time. Verma was writing um, in the 60s in former Czechoslovakia, and that was a time when Prague, the city, had multiple influences, could accommodate it was opening up suddenly. It was opening up to the West, and it was trying to hold on to the East, to all the good things, um, the humanitarian values that uh, you know socialist philosophy gives us. It was holding on to that. So Verma lived through a very interesting decade of that city. Um, so yeah, they were reading his first novel, Vedin, translated into English as Days of Longing. It there were certain markers, the landscape, the pace of life that I could perceive in that novel was very similar to the pace of life I'd experienced as a student in Sofia. The first scene of Vedin uh, takes place in a hostel room where the narrator is looking out of a plate glass window to, and the hostel that I lived in, yeah, I was transported back to my own room when I read that, certainly. Yeah.
I don't read much of non-fiction, so very few biographies I read, and this I started reading, and I really liked the book. I really liked the way it is written. Then I was wondering why I liked it, right? So it occurred to me that for the last 3 years we have been talking to various translators, writers, and all, but mostly I understand we talk to translators as if they are serious readers more than the translation part of it, which they are, right? So, the very, very interesting part about the book, the way you have written the book, is the style of writing. It's not like any conventional biography. It's like a reader's inquiry into writer's life through his work. I got to know Nirmal Verma, the writer, and you get to know Vineet Gill, the reader, too. There were a lot of references to the book that you have read. Okay, there are two parts to my question. The first part is, of course, why did you choose this particular style of presenting Nirmal Verma to your readers? That is number one. Through reader's eyes, through your reading. And the other important, question that I have is that normally when we talk to the translators, most of them, they become, some of them at least, they become translators. They pick up a book, they love the writer, they become translators after picking up their favorite writers. So instead, you started writing a biography, kind of literary biography. Why didn't you translate? Why did you start writing a biography?
Let me think. The presentation for the first question. Uh, yeah, I've been very interested in the essay form, particularly, and the essay as a very expansive and a form that can embrace almost all other forms, can take those and um, absorb the influences of all the other forms and the rhythms of all the other forms, and yet remain an essay. So one form of the essay, or one variety of the essay, is the critical essay. Um, I think there is a great tradition of the critical essay that is engaging and that is directed at the common reader, not a specialist class. You know, so that, and I have in mind writers like Virginia Woolf, who had a great couple of books, two volumes of critical essays. They call The Common Reader, volumes one and two. So that is one. There are several such writers who used criticism for creative ends. Who used critical writing as a vehicle to express creative ideas, or as a kind of a way to sort of channel their creativity. Um, and that was the objective here. My objective here was to attempt something novelistic, for the want of a better word. You know, it's a much misunderstood term, the novel, and it's almost as difficult to understand and pin down as the essay. So what do I mean by that? I think a space where one can explore the meaning of the literary. That's what I broadly mean, right? And um, and it's a medium through which I can express my ideas in my own voice. And by voice, again, it's a very important critical term. The voice is where the writer's voice is where the literary resides. And so the book was basically an excuse. Verma subject was an excuse um, that would allow me to write about all these other things that I wanted to write about, and our thoughts uh, kind of overlapped so much. I mean, some of the ideas that I was interested in, Verma had always been interested in, and Verma had written about, expanded upon. So, so that, yeah, it became a way to, um, express things I wanted to express in writing. Um, Also, I had in mind a few books that are very important to me. One was Nicholson Baker's book on John Updike, You and I. Um, it's a strange work. Strange, this term. I wanted, yeah, I really always aspire to achieve that, that kind of badge of honor. If somebody says this is very strange, this book, that I take it always as a compliment, and I mean it always as a compliment when I say that it was a very strange work. So Nicholson Baker's book was extremely strange, and uh, what it did was kind of made me think about it's a brief book about his love for writer John Updike, and he digresses all the time. He talks about his own story, and then his struggles to become a writer and so on, and then Updike, a lot of Updike. So there have been several such books, um, and before and after Baker, um, so which I had in mind when I approached this book. Um, so that was one thing. Second thing was that I was so completely incapable of writing a serious, uh, a thick, uh, footnoted, peer-reviewed biography. Um, Totally incapable. I wouldn't want to read it. Also, I sometimes find it very boring. Also, those very very well researched biographies, unless there is some presence of the writer that I can feel, the biographer. So it's towards the beginning when the thought first occurred to me. I thought I'll write a book about a writer, and it has to be a biography because um, that was the default direction I went in. And then I started rethinking. Then I thought it doesn't have to be that necessarily. Um, I can it can be an attempt, as all essays are. The essay, the very term, uh, etymologically links to the word attempt, right? So I thought, let it be an attempt to write a biography, and let it be a failed attempt, and let it become a way to justify that failure, and that becomes the book. So that's what I think happened. Yeah. So that was the first part. Second, translations. This is this book is also partly a work of translation. The passages that come to me from Nirmal Verma have never been translated before. They're not available anywhere in English, and they're available here. And so what I kept doing while writing, I was translating. In the midst of that, um, so that it became the act of composing my own sentences and translating someone else's. became part of the same creative process for me while writing this book. And it was very stimulating, and it also made me think very carefully about the art of translation. So I've translated Verma's essays at length as well. I've translated an essay that is in Shabd aur Smriti uh, about Borges, Verma's. Um, he attended a talk by Borges in London in the 70s. And I've translated that. That's been published in a magazine called Literary Activism.
Oh, wonderful.
And as it happens, my next book is a book of translation. So, so I think I've also I've succumbed to that temptation of translating. So yeah,
Nirmal Verma in 50s and 60s, he moved to Europe and he stayed there for a long time. How do you think it shaped his literary career and writing?
it was crucial. His European years were crucial to his writing. It was central to it, I think. And he began. His first novel was written there, and it's set there. Veden is set in Prague. He went to Prague in 1959 on a translation fellowship, actually. So we come back to the idea of the translator and the creative writer, and what separates and what unites them. Right. So in Indian literary traditions, um, it's very difficult to come across a novelist or a poet who wasn't also a translator, who wasn't also a critic. You know, all these roles, um, they played all of these roles kind of simultaneously at the same time, and equally well. So Varma went to Prague on a translation fellowship with the commitment of translating modern Czech fiction into Hindi, which he started doing as he went there. He learned the Czech language and started translating those books into Hindi and publishing the translations here. Meanwhile, he was working on his own writings, and so and interacting with European writers through the medium of literature as well as directly. He had many friends in Czechoslovakia, people who were writing, and he was traveling to different parts of Europe and meeting with uh, young writers as well as established writers. He met, um, the Icelandic writer Laxness and interviewed him in the 60s. This was again a kind of a remarkable example of multiculturalism, literary multiculturalism. That is impossible to think of in today's globalized world. It's impossible to think of a Hindi writer from Karol Bagh um, being intensely interested in an unknown kind of a virtually unknown writer. Before his Nobel Prize, he wasn't known at all. Laxness sitting in Reykjavik, and yet both of them meet and then talk about Tagore, among other things. Uh, what a strange journey, right? And what an interesting world that was. Um, so, so it shaped him as a writer. It completely, I think, formed him as a writer, and his not just aesthetic ideas that he was deriving from Europe, but all from European um, streams of thought, but also political ideas. You know, he witnessed firsthand the days of Prague Spring in '68, and and then also the way it was crushed by the Soviet regime and the imposition of a new dictatorship in Czechoslovakia. He witnessed all that, and it formed um, it influenced his political ideas, I think, also. So when he returned to India, I think in the 70s, um, he was often criticized for being too European to be an Indian writer. Tagore was also attacked, among in the same kind of terms. So that he was called, I think jokingly, Anant Murthy once called him uh, an East European writer of Hindi. You know, but yeah, but there were um, other more serious attacks on him also. A lot, he lost friends, admirers, who thought he was not Indian enough. So, um, and that's maybe affected him a little as well, because he spent a lot of his time um, in the second half of his career, if you can look at it that way. When he returned to India, he spent a lot of his time thinking about Indianness and what makes an Indian writer Indian enough. You know, so yeah, these forces played a central part. The pull of Europe and the pull of India. You know, he was subjected to both of these.
Yeah, and he came back to India from Europe, and these were really charged times, 70s and 80s. Very politically charged atmosphere was there. How politically engaged is Nirmal Verma, either through his writing or through expressing his opinions?
But he was very committed. He understood very well the responsibility uh, of a man of letters towards society. He you know he grew up in the tradition created by Premchand. After all, you couldn't be politically responsible, or you couldn't claim uh, the high ground of the apolitical thinker, the philosopher in the ivory tower. You couldn't do that. Hindi literature has always been uh, a kind of a very politically charged tradition, and there have been disputes. There are there are writers writing against each other, all sorts of manifestos and movements. Every decade you look back and something or the other comes up. So this was the kind of um, context from which Verma emerges. So it's wrong to think of him as an apolitical writer, or as a writer uninterested in politics. If you read his um, Prague book, Har Barish Mein, it has been translated into English, unfortunately, but it's one of the best records of his Prague years, and of the decline of that of decline of a fledgling democracy um, into a completely hopeless and dark dystopia. Uh, that book captures it very well, and it's an out and out political book. It's a political memoir of his years there. Verma wrote in very, very strong terms um, against the emergency in Delhi, um, against the emergency in India. He marched with people on the streets, and um, some say that he was on that list when the witch hunts began in Delhi. Verma was certainly on the list. He was certainly friends with people. He was friends with the wrong kind of people at that time, and you could get in trouble for that. Um, so yeah, and so it, he was political. He was aware socially. He was conscientious as a writer. When he returned to India, he wrote again in a kind of in a very angry tone against the changes that he was able to perceive and observe in Delhi during the 80s, late 70s, 80s, when um, when everything was about new money coming in when life was becoming corporatized uh, in a rather off-putting way. So, and the result of which we now see in the city that I live in. So Verma wrote about all that, and I think all these positions that he took were very political positions.
You touched upon it already that he's an essayist, written a lot of essays,
Hmm.
and he was into fiction too. So essays are more like directly communicating your ideas with the readers, right? To what extent these opinions were reflected in his fiction work?
His political opinions.
Yes.
The essay, first thing about the essay, I my understanding of the essay is that it's not a domain separate from other creative forms like fiction and poetry. It's the same. Uh, the area of operation is the same for the essay. It depends on the essayist where the essayist chooses to take it. You know, when Verma wrote his essays, they are again some of the best um, works of the imagination you'll ever come across. His essay on Borges unfolds like a Joycean short story. It's brilliant. It ends the last few passages are as the narrator walks from the auditorium to the tube station in London, in the snow of London, and descends into the underground, ruminating about literature. They're just a brilliant scene, you know. So the essay that Verma wrote, the essays that he wrote, I don't think he ever thought of them as inferior to his short stories of fiction. The same, uh, have an equal standing in his body of work. Um, so whether his creative political ideas reflected directly in his fiction, um, I don't think so because there were other questions that he was preoccupied with um, as a fiction writer. You know, these are different modes in which you could write, and um, you could choose a particular mode in in order to address a particular set of questions. You know, I see his fiction as more concerned with existential ideas, uh, as an exploration of um, what it means to be alive in a particular setting in a particular time. You know, and what it means to die. More
Okay.
importantly,
Yes,
that's a
yes.
question he's obsessed with. Verma is
Yeah,
obsessed
you
with that
started the
question.
book with the same thing. You
Yeah.
started the book with the first chapter is about his death.
Yes. Yeah. Because you see, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Everything he wrote. To it was his uh, it was his big question. It was his big inquiry. Uh, as it was with so many of our great writers. Just thinking about it all the time. Mm, but Verma, I think, gives expression to it uh, a lot. His short stories and uh, novel. There isn't a work that, especially his fiction, you can't come across one that doesn't have a kind of a direct reference or portrayal uh, of or reflections upon mortality.
You have read almost, I think, every sentence that Nirmal Verma wrote, which is published. Other than reading his work, what is the kind of preparation that you had to do in writing this book? What kind of a research went into that? I gather that in the book you mentioned about you visiting Prague, the places where he visited and all.
Hmm. Um, mm, this was a. Let me. I traveled to Prague for a few days. Um, to see what I I tried to trace what people he knew, people who knew him, and there was very few um, people around. Many are dead now, of course. Um, so I met with a very elderly scholar who, you know, I sent her my book also. She was very old when I met her, over 90 years. I don't know where she is now. Um, um, she was a professor of Indology, I think, over there, and she translated a lot of Indian. Um, I quote her in my book, translated Verma, and uh, She was fluent in Hindi. So I met with her. I tried to um, I paid a visit to the Oriental um, Institute to see if I could get these were. I think I didn't have to do any of this. So it was something that I'd planned. That again, it you fall back on the conventional ideas of biography or conventional ideas of writing about a writer. Um, I had a proposal down, and I thought, okay, now it's going to be a biography because that's the only thing you can do when your subject is a writer. And let me just read everything by him and hunt for the archives, look at the unpublished letters, meet the surviving relatives, visit the places he lived in, look at the old home, go on a journey following in the footsteps. But these are all cliches also of the biography form. Each time I would go there, I think what happened was would I started telling myself that this is exactly not what I want to do. You know, I don't want to trace his footsteps in Prague necessarily. So then that Prague chapter includes a short, a brief kind of record of a night in Prague that has nothing to do with Burma as such. Just so it becomes a record of my own impressions walking in that city, right? And um, so these trips were undertaken in a spirit of uh, I don't know, a scholarly spirit that I'm going to unearth something unbelievable and add it to my book. But yeah, it was these were just ways to um, address that anxiety, perhaps. That there has to be some research, there has to be some movement the writer has to make before you actually become static. And that's when the real work begins. When you're at your desk night after night and you're finishing draft after draft, that's where the real thing happens. And that's where that's where you also, it's a form of research also, discover. It's where you discover what you have to say, what has survived in your research, all the reading that you've done. Uh, what am I going to make use of? That's when you figure that out. That's when you find that out. So, in terms of preparation, the you know, I don't know, just the reading that I did. I think besides Verma, I did a lot of useless reading. That's another important part of my research for the next book and the next book. The reading that is not directly of use to you for that project, but that's essential, I think, for any writer. That may give you some interesting ideas.
No, I didn't get that part. In which way?
Um, so let me think about. Well, as a writer, basically it becomes a way to stay in touch, to sort of keep up as a reader. That's one thing. You know. Not let casual reading be reduced to, or don't elevate it to the status of research. Because you're thinking in a different way when you're researching a book. When you're reading as a researcher, you're taking notes. You all the time um, reading in a kind of an acquisitive way. What can I absorb? What will I take? When you're reading casually without thinking of research, when you're doing useless reading, what your mind absorbs are the only things that matter in your writing. Are the real things that will actually add value to your writing. Whereas when you're researching, there is no filter there. You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's what I have in mind. So, and how useless reading helps me is also it kind of prevents me from getting bored. It keeps me kind of interested in the whole enterprise of reading and writing, because research can have a deadening effect on you. Because by definition, it is reading that you don't want to do. You this book came through a series of useless books that I picked up. When I first picked up Verma, or even in the subsequent years, everything, all this was never going to be of any use to me. I'm pretty clear that I'm just reading it and absorbing it without meaning to. And then all this kind of comes together, and years down the line, you realize that this was valuable.
No, I was wondering, as a copy editor, you had to read books with a lot of intent, right? What kind of an effect it has on the books that you read for pleasure, or in your own words, the useless books that you read?
Um, as a copy editor or as an editor, when you're reading a book, it's very different, because you're way more engaged. You're almost collaborating with the writer. You try to uh, intervene, and yet try not to do too much, not to the extent that you'll replace the writer, in certain places. So, yeah, your job is to make helpful interventions to assist the writer. So you're thinking in a very different way. When I'm editing, um, it's I'm always zoomed into the sentence. I'm looking at it very, very closely, and looking at what can be improved, what can be dropped, you know. Or even when I'm reading manuscripts and so on, it's um, um, it can sometimes you come across books that suddenly that do give you pleasure as a reader, right? And then um, you slip into that mode again as a reader. You are reading for pleasure, but you have to remind yourself to get out of that trance and reread again, uh, to break the spell of the text. You're trying again and again to break the spell that the writer is trying to cast on you. Well, whereas as a reader, again, the useless reading, the reading for pleasure, you're submitting again and again. You're trying to submit to the writer. Yeah, I think that's what it becomes. It's difficult, but it becomes easy if you are reading as a critic anyway. If you, I don't mean to say that the casual reader or somebody who's reading, the serious reader, um, you submit yourself to the writer's uh, intentions. That is important, even if you're a critic. You submit because you accept the rules set by the writer first. Yeah, that's important, right? And so what it does is, I think, being a critical reader, you're able to make that switch more easily than others, because it's I think it's there is the voice in the back of your head, always ready to go, hang on, just go back to this, go back, you know, go back to this passage. And that can happen even when I enjoy something. I often go back to read again, more often than not. When I've enjoyed a few pages, I go back, and that's a critic in me sending the critic in me who's sending me back to those pages. The spell is briefly broken, you know, in a good way, and I'm trying to relive those passages, and also trying to see what it is that works here. I'm trying to think like a writer at that point, and thinking, what did I just respond to so well? And when you come across something crappy, uh, it's a critic in you who makes you, you know, who says to you, it's not worth your time. Shut the book. Just throw it away, throw it out the window. Straight. So, uh, or think about ways of improving it. Think about ways of enhancing it. So there are these switches in your head as a reader, and you get better at it with time, I suppose.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, are there any translations of Nirmal Verma's works? Because I was from Hindi to English. Because I was going through Amazon, I couldn't find any. Not even a single translation is available.
So Penguin has published a couple of translations. One of Wade In, Days of Longing, translated as. Uh, uh, I think it's been done by Krishna Baldev Vaid, the Hindi writer. A great Hindi writer also he was. And the other one is Lal Teen Ki Chhat, translated as The Red Tin Roof. These two were published under Modern Classics.
Modern classics, okay.
Published under Modern Classics. And some years back. So I think you should be able to find these books, or maybe order them directly from the Penguin website or something. Just see, because I have both these books as Penguin editions, but not. There was another book of stories and one more novel that was published a couple of publishing houses. I don't remember which ones, but yeah, nothing much has been done since.
To put it mildly, it is shocking. So, what do you think is the reason for this? It's general lack of interest in translations, or anything specific to the writer?
Not at all. A general lack of interest in things that are older than 3 months or 4 months. That's the kind of memory span that we have as a culture. You know, to keep alive a memory of a writer who died in 2005, who did most of his work in the 70s, 80s, 90s. You need a critical culture. You need a culture. You need, a whole system of magazines, and editors and critics and readers, which we lack, sadly. Um, so it's yeah. Whereas I should clarify that in Verma's case, there is a devoted following that Verma has. Almost a sort of cult-like following on social media and here and there. One keeps coming across Verma fans and readers who genuinely admire Verma's work. But for some reason, all this doesn't translate to a real living critical culture that is essential for any literature to survive. Verma understood that, and he himself was a critic, remained a critic, wrote about other writers, and championed other people's work for that reason. Because if you stop doing that, if you just celebrate writers and their reputations, then the world forgets them. And the books go out of print and never to be recovered. Verma is among the most prominent writers from the previous century. If there are many who are actually forgotten, there are many who wrote in Hindi, many who wrote in English, who are today forgotten, whose books can't even be traced because they went out of print decades back, but who are well respected and who spent whole careers, building a body of work that is just completely gone. So um, that's the sad reality that we're part of.
That brings me to the final question. You've been with Penguin, and there are a lot of translations, English translations coming from Indian languages. A lot of books are being published. The marketability of these translations, the quality of translations. Overall, how do you see this whole ecosystem, how it is working? Translations of Indian language books into English.
It's in the boom phase, the market right now. It's been for some time when it comes to translations into English, particularly. Lots of writers are coming up. Lots of contemporary Hindi writers also are being translated. What's lacking, sadly, is the translations in the other direction from English into languages. That's I don't see that happening. From so I don't know why that is. Again, inexplicable why Hindi readers wouldn't be interested in books published in English. And I don't know about what the scene is right now, but there was a time when there was a very vibrant tradition of translations between the Indian languages among those uh, the Indian languages, so Bengali into Marathi and Hindi and Gujarati, all that. A lot of writers were learning from each other. Thinking of Premchand's um, interest in Tagore and how he was influenced by the Bengali short story before he began writing his own. So that also I don't see much of. I don't know much about that, but I'd like someone to maybe talk about it and look into this also. What's happening within other languages, among those languages. Because English is the kind of establishment language. It's the language of the market. That's where the capital is. All the books, all the other writers and publishers in various languages would be magnetized by, would be definitely attracted to this behemoth. But um, how to make this a two-way street, we don't know yet. You know. Although I hear that there's a lot of interest in, uh, for instance, I was speaking to somebody and they told me that uh, publishers in Malayalam and Kannada are interested in European books, and there are direct translations from German into Malayalam that are happening, bypassing English altogether. That's very encouraging to hear.
Tamil, Malayalam, and Kannada, I think, yeah, from European languages, they're coming into.
That's brilliant. I mean, that's not happening too much in Hindi. You see, it used to happen because of people like Verma and Bhisham Sahani and others. They sort of they became bridges to different cultures, to Russia, Czechoslovakia, to Europe, America. Of course, there were um, contacts between little magazines in the U.S. and in India. All that has vanished now. But it's very heartening to know that some cultures are still in touch with that old tradition, and the old open sort of cosmopolitan tradition.
But as far as translations into English is concerned, you see, market is really decent, is it? So they are selling well, in your experience from Penguin.
I mean, I don't know why the market is such. I know that suddenly there is a trend. I can see the trend, and this means that they must be doing well. I mean, there was the Booker Prize and so on, and all those things have helped it. help this fuel this trend. I see all that, and it's encouraging for it should be encouraging for any translator. Maybe I don't know, but what I don't see even in English translations um, in this language, in scholarship, and in the literature being written here around translation. I don't see any real engagement, any real critical engagement with translation as a form. So there aren't, no, if I, yeah, I mean, which was happening, a lot of translators and a lot of poets and artists were all the time thinking about translation very, very actively. Today, it's kind of taken for granted. It's almost like um, you have one language and you have another. It just form bridges between the two, and that's translation. It's that simple. But earlier there were aesthetic theories about what gets lost, what is gained. What are the kinds of translations? What responsibilities does translator have towards the work, towards the two languages, not just one? So these questions, I don't know who's asking them.
You mean to say there is no discourse at all about these things? Okay.
Yeah, around that's been dead for a while. Uh, you know, it's still happening in the West certainly, and it's I think it has been revived in the West. Some great translators, um, Susan Bernofsky, Michael Hoffman, they've written brilliantly about the art of translation, and trying to challenge our ideas about what translation can do. It can be something unlike the work that you translated from. Now, and it's still a translation, and we've lived in that tradition. We've lived in the tradition of bhakti poets. The Kabir translations by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, for instance, just brilliant, and in the blues tradition, he's translated those poems. But they make us think about the possibilities of translation as a creative activity, right? But now, I think it's what it has become is simply, giving a new readership access to a particular work. It's become limited to that, in my view.
Right, then thank you for your time, and thank you for such wonderful conversation.
Thanks for reading the book, and for doing this.